Today I'm going to show you how to make some really simple box joints so you can create a bunch of gifts and give them out to family and friends. I'm going to be using a table saw to make these box joints, but you don't have to have a high dollar table saw to do this. You can have a simple contractor's saw and it should be able to do the same thing. As long as it has these slots that are in alignment with the blade, everything should work well. You will also need the miter gauge that came with your table saw. Now if by chance you have a table saw sled, this right here will make it a little bit easier and a little faster to line everything up. But if you don't, that is okay. I'm going to show you the process with the miter gauge, so just about everybody should be able to do this. Before we get to the first step, make sure your table saw is unplugged because we have to do a bunch of measurements and adjustments, including touching the blade quite a bit, and we don't want it to accidentally come on. Now I'm going to take the miter gauge and I'm going to insert it in one of the slots. Some table saws come with 2 slots, some only come with 1. It just depends. Once it's in the slot, I'm going to try and move it side to side. In my case, there's no movement. If there is movement, you need to adjust your miter gauge and get that movement out. Now, of course, you still want it to move freely back and forth. Next up, we need to find a nice straight piece of wood. It doesn't have to be overly sized, and in fact, it doesn't even have to be brand new. You can see I have a cut right there in it. There's a couple screw holes already in the back. So this is already kind of a pre-used piece of wood. The main concern is to make sure it is nice and straight and not warped. As long as that works, you should be able to use it. I then just use a couple stubby screws and some washers to attach the miter gauge to the piece of wood, making sure that the wood is nice and flush on the top of the table saw and that there's no screws protruding through the back. Now this next step is one of the most important pieces to make sure your box joints look nice. And that is to make sure that our piece of wood in our miter gauge is exactly 90 degrees to the blade. Let me show you. I've slid the miter gauge into position and I've raised the blade up slightly. Now I'm going to take a square and I'm going to press it up against the wood and the blade, making sure they are 90 degrees from each other. Now be careful you're not touching one of the teeth, or that could throw the measurement off quite a bit. And of course, depending on your table saw and your miter gauge, it might take a bunch of adjustment to get it exactly 90, but make sure that's a critical point. If by chance you have a table saw sled or you plan to make one, this should be a lot easier because you don't have to do all those adjustments with the miter gauge. The slot you already have down the middle of your sled should already be 90 degrees to the backing right here, just making everything already lined up for you. And if you want to learn how to build a table saw sled, I actually built this one specifically for beginners in a previous video. I'll put a link to that in the description and at the end of the video. At this point, if you haven't done this already, we need to determine which pieces of wood we're going to use to make the box. In this case, these are about 6 inches long and about 2.5 inches wide. Of course, you don't have to have this exact size. You can do whatever you want to make your box. Next, take one of your pieces of wood and set it right next to your blade. You want to make sure that the top edge of your blade, the little teeth on it, are not any higher than the top or the thickness of your wood. In this case here, I need to lower it just a little bit, but make sure it's right flush with the top. I just realized in the process of setting this up, my finger is going to be a little bit closer to the blade than I actually prefer. So I'd strongly suggest if you're going to do this process, get a wider board, one that's a little bit taller here, so your fingers will be much further away. Now I'm going to continue with this process so I don't have to restart everything, but just please be careful when you're doing this. And of course, if you don't feel 100% comfortable making cuts like this on a table saw, stop. Don't do it. Go get somebody else who has experience. Now that we have everything set up, I've laid out the pieces of wood in order as we're going to do the box joints. And to do that, we're going to need a square and a pencil. Now, if you want to measure out your box joints and make sure they are perfectly even all the way across, you can. But that's going to take some time and some math. Let me show you a little bit easier way. Now we know that this board is roughly 2.5 inches across, but let's say we didn't know that. Let's take our square. We want to just eyeball this. We want to measure out roughly 1/3 of the width of this board. And that's what I've done here. So then I'm going to take a pencil and I'm just going to mark just like that. Then I'm going to flip it around and do the same exact measurement on the opposite side. Just like that. Then I repeated this process so that I have marks on both sides and both ends of each board. I also went in here and put a letter on the ends that connect so don't get those mixed up either. Also, when I start cutting, the first one and the third one are going to look identical. So I'm going to position those two together and the second and the fourth one together so there's no chance of me grabbing the wrong one. And now it's time to make our first cut, but not actually in our project yet. We need to make a cut in our sacrificial board so we know exactly where the blade's going to be and we can measure everything up. Now I'm going to take one of the boards with the lines on it and I went ahead and put some X's on the material that I'm actually going to remove. I'm going to take this and I'm going to line it up, making sure it's on the correct side of the material I want to move, and line it up with the outside edge of this cut, about like so. Then I'm going to take another board and I'm going to clamp it in place so I can have a stop block. Then I'm going to take that same board and I'm going to line it up on the edge against this sacrificial piece. And we're going to make that first cut, and that way we'll know exactly where that corner for that box joint will be. And once that first cut is in place, I'm just going to rotate this around and repeat that on the other side, and then flip this over and do those two cuts as well. Now that we have all four corners in place, I'm just going to continue to slowly move the wood over, chipping away at the remaining pieces until it's all gone. Now that I have these cut out, I need to mention one thing. This right here, I realized, is a low quality piece of pine, just trash wood. It was used probably for a furring strip, and well, it's gonna have some tear out in it, so don't be surprised on this. But it surprisingly doesn't look as bad as you might think, considering it is low quality wood. Now if you had some high quality hardwood, this would look a lot better. Now that I have the box joints on the first and the third pieces, I need to cut the second and the fourth. But instead of the outside, I need to cut the insides. And for these pieces, I'm actually not going to use a stop block on the side over here. I'm just going to hand hold these and cut each piece out, making sure I do not cut into those lines. And then at this point, I'm going to check to see how close we actually are. It looks like I still need to remove just a little bit from each side, but it is really close, so I can only move just a hair from each side to get that to fit. And these are still a tight fit, but that just might work. Then of course repeat the cuts on the last piece, and we're getting close to being done. Let me show you exactly how snug these need to be. You want them to be able to slide together and not fall apart. Now I overcut this with just ever so slightly, and I want to show you the difference. When I put them together, you really can't see much of a difference, but if I let go, it just falls apart. Now I'm going to do my best to continue using this piece that I slightly overcut, but just realize if this is your first time making one of these, you're still going to probably make a mistake. Heck, this is not my first time and I just made a mistake, but I believe I can still make it work. So just realize every time you do this, you're going to get a little bit better and a little bit better. The next step, if I was truly going to make this into a box, would be to create a groove across the same spot on all four pieces so I can have a little bottom that'll slide into place. But I'm just going to skip that step for now, and we're just going to glue these together. After giving this a little bit of time to dry, I want to show you this up close in all the joints, show you ways that we can improve upon it and speed up this process. Looking at this joint here, if you look close, you can tell that cut wasn't the flattest across that piece, and therefore there's a little bit of tear out and it just doesn't look really even. These sides look good, but just not right there. Looking at this side, we had the similar problem right here. It's not the flushest of cuts, but, you know, I mean, at a glance, it could work. Now keep in mind that we use a factory miter gauge. I used the standard saw blade that came with my table saw, and this is low quality wood. Well, overall, I think that came out pretty good. Now let me show you some ways to improve upon this to make this look really nice. Now if you were only allowed to make one upgrade to continue this process, I would definitely upgrade the saw blade. This right here is about a $60 blade, and let me show you the difference. On the factory blade, we have different teeth. One kind of cuts a little bit to the right, one cuts a little bit to the left, and it's almost like a slicing motion. And so you're going to have little grooves in all of your flat surfaces. Versus this new blade actually has flat teeth at the top. So instead of a slicing motion, it's almost like a chipping motion, kind of like a chisel. It cleans everything nice and flat all the way across. So I decided to make one more joint using this new blade, and it might be a little bit hard to tell on camera. This is still the same low quality wood, but in each of these joints, everything's a little bit flatter, a little nicer, and it just fits together a lot better. Plus, I haven't put any glue in this joint either, where in the other piece, some of that glue could have filled in some of those gaps and those holes and make it look a little bit nicer than it actually is. Where in this case, I don't have any glue, so therefore all that is a nice and flush fit. So if you're interested in buying this blade or just finding out a little bit more information, I'll put a link to it in the description. And once you've upgraded that blade and you've had a little bit of practice, I'd definitely invest in some better quality wood, preferably like a hardwood that looks really pretty in the grain, and that way you can make these boxes really nice and people will love them. I also highly recommend building yourself a table saw sled. It'll make this process so much easier and so much faster because you don't have to always double check and make sure your miter gauge is exactly 90 degrees. It should be built into your sled, which will just make this process so much faster. Plus, your table saw sled can be used for so many other things, and you'll just be surprised at how many times you grab it to make cuts. Now, if you're interested in building one of these, I'll put a link right over here. Otherwise, get out in your shop and have fun building.